Okay. Greetings. This is a much delayed video on the media theory and criticism, and this talk is really just about focusing on the story and what elements of the story we need to think about and talk about when we're studying a film and trying to figure out how it works. Let's remember the first thing we do when we watch a movie is really take note of our experience of the film. What did we think? What did we feel? How did we respond? Did we like it? Did we hate it? Did we cry? Did we laugh? And generally, what is the feeling you're left with? And what thoughts are you left with? That experience is ultimately what I assume any director in movie is trying to accomplish. Sometimes it's making you think and feel things that isn't what they intended. And so, our study of film is to figure out how are these experiences created and how do the elements of that film put together create that experience. And if it fails, why does it fail? And ultimately, for your study, how do I fix it? How do I create a film and a story that does what I want it to do? So this week we're going to be talking about just the story elements. Now, we've had a conceptual storytelling class and we've learned a whole lot about how storytelling works. And even though, in the, what's the book that we're reading? The Art of Watching Movies or something like that. I can't even remember the name of the damn book. But Chapter 3 talks about fictional and dramatic elements. And it does a very cursory job of exploring the different elements of the story that we need to pay attention to. It really does sort of very broad strokes. But I'd like to think you'd lean on your conceptual storytelling class in terms of how story works and, probably do a much more specific job of figuring out how the story tells the story the way it does. But let's just kind of go through this little PowerPoint presentation for Chapter 3 and follow his way of breaking down story and maybe add in some of our own storytelling knowledge. Film analysis and literary analysis, the elements of a good story. So he breaks things down into the 5 elements of good story. Every good story has to have these 5 things. Unified in plot, okay? That means that, every aspect of the film, every character, every scene feels like it's all part of the same movie. I know I've seen films where there's a particular storyline that seems out of place or a character that seems out of place, and sometimes it has to do with the fact that that character and that character's conflict doesn't seem to complicate or connect with the other storylines, and so it feels like it's not part of the film. Sometimes a particular tone, like, I've got a serious movie and one particular storyline or a particular scene seems very slapsticky, and I'm like, why is that in the film? Unified in plot feels like every scene, every moment, every character is moving the story forward. Credible, it's got to seem credible. That means that I believe it. Anytime we watch a film, we go in willing to suspend our disbelief about what we're going to see. We watch the movie Star Wars or any kind of science fiction film, and we don't sit there the whole time going, I don't believe those spaceships exist. No, they don't exist, but you're really focusing on other aspects of the story. If your attention is on the characters and the conflict, then you're not necessarily questioning the credibility of the film. So how credible is it? And that can be done. Sometimes you watch a film, and if you know a lot about a particular subject, you might point out, well, that's just, that's not the way it goes. If you really find yourself making those observations, chances are there's something wrong with the story in terms of the character and the conflict. And that should be drawing your attention and not, the nuance of any particular situation or whatnot. So is it credible? Is it interesting? That's real specific. Yeah, it's got to be interesting. What makes the story interesting? I feel like that's where a lot of our conceptual storytelling concepts come in. Getting the audience engaged in a question right away. And not answering it, creating tension because we want the answer to those questions. So, how much is the story in command of its audience? How much is it staying ahead of the audience? The storyteller knows what the audience wants to know, is manipulating the audience in terms of the feelings that they're having, the conflict that they're feeling about what's going on in the story. I think that's what makes a story interesting. It's kind of like, the movie Castaway. If I told you it's a guy stuck on an island, you'd go, well, how do you do 2 hours of story there? I mean, it doesn't seem very interesting to me. But as we get into the character and the way the story is told and the conflicts that the character is facing and the amount of empathy we feel towards that character, we understand that character, it becomes interesting very fast. A good story is both simple and complex. It's a contradiction. I mean, simple meaning we can follow the conflict. We can identify the character easily, just like in a short film, right? We can identify the character. We understand what that character's objective is, through the whole film. And moment to moment, scene by scene, we understand what the character's after. That's what makes it simple. I can follow the conflict. It's not confusing to me. What makes a film complex is how the different simple complexes or conflicts weave in and out of each other, how they complicate each other. That's what makes something complex. We like films with a bit of complexity. If it was always just one line of conflict from beginning to end, it'd get kind of boring very quickly. So how well does the film serve, how simple is it in terms of understanding the conflict, and how complex? How many different lines of conflict are there, and how well do they complicate each other? A good story handles emotional material with restraint. I think we learned this, that emotion in movies needs to be restrained in a sense. That doesn't mean that we can't show somebody just screaming in rage or weeping uncontrollably. We can have those moments. We just don't want to begin with that. Okay, if we have the all the title sequence and then cut to a woman screaming in rage at the camera, I mean, I think we'd all just get up and walk out of the theater at that point. It's just too much too quickly. We don't understand who this person is. We don't understand what they're at, and I'm sort of in the line of fire, as it were. I mean, when we walk in a room and somebody's emoting and we don't know that person or what where they're at or who they are or why they're emoting, our instinct is just to turn around and walk right back out. That's. So it has to deal with restraint. It has to prepare us. It has to get us behind the character. We have to empathize with the character, and then they can start emoting, and we understand why they're feeling what they're feeling. Otherwise, it turns into melodrama. So when somebody emotes and we really can't identify why they're feeling that way. So those are the 5 elements of good story. What you want to do is you watch your film, and you want to assess the movie for those 5 elements. How do you feel about those things? And you need to write about them and write your thoughts about them in terms of your experience. You want to connect all these things to how you experience the film. If you hated it, then, or if you felt like you didn't like it, okay, that's a good start. But then you need to go through these 5 elements of good story and figure out, well, where did the film fail and why? If you loved it, you need to go through the 5 elements and explain why you loved it. Be specific about how the film served each of these 5 elements. All right, so let's go on to the next slide here. The significance of the title. It actually is a big deal, because when you go into a movie, you sit down and technically you know nothing about the story except for what you bring in with you. So if you should know the title. I mean, that's anybody ever gone to a movie and was like, you know what, I'm just going to pick a theater. I'm going to pick Theater 13 and I'm going to sit down and I don't even know what it is. No, I mean, we always know the title, and that does influence what our expectations are for the story. What is the significance of the title? After seeing the film, after going through that experience, how does the title how did it influence, your expectations? Was it significant at all? I mean, sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes you're scratching your head, well, why the hell was a film called that? We watched, if you've ever seen the film 21 Grams, normally in media theory, I ask, when we get to this point, the film I screen is 21 Grams because the plot structure is very different. The film title does have some significance. It sets up some expectations that are broken in the film, and it ends up being a much broader thematic connection to the story and makes you think afterwards. You're like, 21 grams, okay, what, the title of the film has much more significance after you've experienced the film than it does before, because 21 grams, you might think, hey, what? Is it a film about, drugs or cocaine, or what is it about? Because it is sort of a gritty film. So, significance of the title. Dramatic structure. So this is another aspect of, we go back to our storytelling, so we break it down. Does it have structure? Does it have a good hook? Does it have an inciting incident? Does it have point of no return? I mean, you really want to study the film. I mean, how well is the story structured? Linear, chronological structure, or is it nonlinear? Fine-tuning the denouement, whatever. Okay, was it insatisfying, basically, and if it wasn't, why not? And generally speaking, I tend to find that at the end of a film, satisfaction comes with revelation. And we understand revelation being one answer answering more than one question in the story. And the ending of the film wrapping up and answering all of the questions that get brought up in the story. Films that fail to do that, or answer with, provide answers that seem cheap or unearned, that's where that whole Deus Ex Machina thing, the hand of God comes down and fixes everything for all the characters. We don't like those kinds of endings. We don't like, the cosmos to intervene in solving our problems. We like to see characters solve their own problems. So we like to see characters take action and solve those problems on their own. That's much more satisfying. We also like emotional catharsis at the end. That means if we are feeling a certain tension, well, the answers provide a release for that tension. And if we're feeling sad or we feel stressed, when we leave the theater, I mean, do you want your audience, did you leave your experience feeling, kind of gross or something? I mean, why did the storyteller let it, end the film that way? Why did the storyteller want us to leave our experience with that feeling? Or does the film sort of release those feelings in some way? And why? Why release them? I mean, typically Hollywood films like to, like happy endings. I mean, we create conflict. We get the audience, in tension and stressed and maybe feeling worried or sad, and then in the end, let's leave the audience with a happy feeling. Things work out. So, how does your film stack up in terms of its dramatic structure? And then conflict. I mean, we understand conflict, right? How does the film have strong conflict? Does it have more than one line of conflict? So, be able to talk about that. And remember, conflict, it's identifying a character. And then once we see the character, we identify that character has an objective of some kind, and we can make it clear. And then only after we understand those two elements can we talk about opposition and appreciate the opposition to this character's objective. How clear is it in the story? How well does does the conflict escalate? And it's hard to have a conversation about conflict without talking about what's at stake, and how, what's at stake escalates. More and more is put at stake throughout the story. That's structure. There's structure to that. So you can talk about and study how that film's conflict is put together and made available to the audience. Characterization is something we can talk about at this point. And it just has to do with how well the characters are drawn. How strong are the characters, and what stands out most. And when we study a film, and we're going to talk about a lot of different things, from cinematography to editing and whatnot. And it's hard to just talk about, let's just talk about everything. Let's just, every little aspect. That's not necessarily what I'm asking you to do in a critical analysis of a film. You really just want to study the salient points of the film. That means the most important points, the points that really stand out to you. Where was the film strongest? In some films, a character is really strong. In some films, the editing is really strong. I mean, when you walk away and I say, I want you to recall, your favorite moments, you should, something comes to mind. And is it a character? Is it a shot? Is it a scene? Is it a sound? What is it? That's what I mean by studying the most important aspects of that film. Well, we can just study characterization and think, okay, what really stands out in terms of the characters in the film? And we can go through this list and look at, well, here's some different ways of looking at how characters stand out in a story. Characterization through appearance. Was there something exceptional about the way they look? Casting has a lot to do with, finding the right look and, interesting faces and sometimes really strange faces. Costuming, the way they're dressed, might be a contradiction to, some aspect of the film. I mean, what stands out? Characterization through dialogue. I mean, what people say and how they speak often tells us a lot about that character. We can look at it as what really defines this character. When we see a person for the first time, sometimes we can make assumptions about who that person is. Well, what really leads us to those assumptions? Is it the way they look? Is it the way they speak? Is it external action, the kinds of things that they do? Characterization through internal action, is it because they're really insecure? Or is it some internal conflict that really influences our opinion about them? Characterization through reactions of other characters. I know I've talked about intimidation. Like, well, how do you make a character intimidating? A character is intimidating not through the action of that particular character. I mean, they can be threatening, but that doesn't mean it's intimidating. It's only intimidating if everybody else acts intimidated. So we learn a lot about a character through the reactions of everybody else. That's what defines that character. What comes to mind is the movie Sexy Beast. If I know I screen that sometimes in storytelling, but if you haven't seen it, I mean, there's one character, Don Logan, that appears, and we really don't know anything about him. And what we learn very quickly is that he's an intimidating dude because everybody acts so strangely around him. That's what defines his character. Characterization through contrast, dramatic foils. Like, we've seen the buddy movies, right? We've seen buddy films where we have two different characters and they're diametric opposites. And it's through the fact that they're drawn as two totally opposite people that it sort of helps us see how each character is defined. One guy's funny and one guy's dour, one guy's irresponsible and one guy's by the book, I mean, that type of thing. Characterization through caricature or leitmotif. Caricature just means, are they exaggerated in some way? A leitmotif means, is it something that seems sort of cliche or repetitive? It's something that we've seen before. Ace Ventura, for example, is a caricature. Okay, Jim Carrey is very good at playing caricature type characters, where through his behavior and the way he acts, it brings to mind something familiar, whether it's a clown or something over the top. Leitmotif is where what we assume about a character is less about what we see in terms of their behavior, and it's sort of like, this person is a policeman, so he wears the mirror sunglasses and he's very sort of unemotional and he's a dickhead, and so a lot of assumptions come to mind based on what we've seen before and what has been repeated over and over again in terms of that character appearing in films. Expectations, right? Characterization through choice of name. Sometimes the name of a character can lead us to make assumptions about their character. It's like, a character named Johnny and a character named Drake. I mean, each of those character names characterize them in some way. Um, Look at your film and figure out, varieties of characters. Well, how much variety of character is in the film? I mean, is it all one particular type, or is there lots of different types of characters? What's interesting, like in a Wes Anderson film, he tends to put a lot of very interesting characters in his movies, and a lot of these things apply. Their appearances tend to define the characters in unique ways. What they say, I tend to think everybody speaks in a very similar, heightened, strange type of language that people don't normally speak, but they all kind of speak that way. So it's not necessarily that the dialogue defines the character as much as it defines the tone of the film. What people do, internal action, foils. I mean, sometimes he puts foils in the film, but I find that in terms of variety of character, there isn't a lot of variety of character in the film. They all seem the same variety of strange. So think about that in terms of your film, the film that you choose, and how characterization is created in your film, and what sort of defines the characters in your film. Allegory, that just means, is there does the story have some sort of symbolic meaning in terms of other familiar stories? I mean, immediately what comes to mind is religious stories, the story of Christ or whatever, or Muhammad or Moses or whatever. But you don't think of it necessarily in terms of religious allegory. Just means, do other stories, familiar stories, come to mind? The fact that Avatar is really just Pocahontas. I mean, things like that. Although I wouldn't say Pocahontas is an allegory, but symbolism is kind of is something to talk about. I don't necessarily think when we walk out of a film and it had a powerful experience, or we had a strong experience, we go, wow, the symbolism was so amazing. Very, very rarely. It's sort of like, if the story sucked, then that's when we're paying it. Well, the story sunk, but the symbolism was fabulous. I mean, I don't know how important it is to talk about it in terms of our experience. In terms of creating a film, it can be a very powerful tool for leading us to certain expectations, maybe. Universal and natural symbols, that when we see a desert, what is a desert a symbol of? Desolation, death, hardship, sometimes just physical, thirst, exposure. I mean, when I show a desert, those things immediately come to mind, and there could be a reason for that. Maybe that's an aspect of the story. Maybe you're trying to lead the audience into those expectations, and to have those expectations about an environment, a story, a character in that environment, or whatnot. Creating symbolic meanings. I mean, you can create a symbolic meaning. I mean, let's say there's a scene where a guy, a father and son are at a table, and they're having dinner, and they're trying to, the son has got a beef with the dad, and the dad is, listening to the son, and the dad's playing with this salt shaker in his hand, and they're having a fight, and it's getting heated, and all of a sudden, the dad is gripping this salt shaker as he's having a heart attack right there in front of his son. And he's gripping the salt shaker, and the son is really looking at the salt shaker going, what the hell is he going on? Is he pissed off? What's happening? And then he realizes what's happening. Well, later in the film, he's sitting in a restaurant, and he's staring at the salt shaker. Well, we know what he's thinking about, right? Because we created a symbol. We created the meaning there between the salt shaker and that experience. Lots of films can create meaning that way. I mean, symbolic patterns and I talked about natural symbols, but universal symbols is like, things that we recognize, the easiest one is the cross, that's pretty universal symbol, or pretty universal symbol. A skull means death, that kind of stuff. Symbolic patterns and progressions, sometimes that we create repetition. And repetition, tends to make things more noticeable when we repeat something over and over again, a visual symbol. Music tends to be the most symbolic pattern. When we hear a phrase of music repeated at different times, and we associate a musical phrase with a particular moment. A character's feeling happy, we hear this music. And then later in the film, we see a character, and in a moment that we're kind of not sure how he's reacting, then the music comes up, and oh, he's happy. That's how he's reacting to it. So we create association through patterns and progressions of how things are repeated. Symbolic values and conflict. The salt shaker is a good example of that. Just in the sense that we understand how the son is what he's experiencing internally in terms of conflict, because the symbol helps us understand. A metaphor, metaphors, or just simply creating associations. Associations that exist. I guess just to represent, in some way. I'm trying to think of a good example. I can't think of one. I'm blanking. But, a metaphor, is, the ocean can be a metaphor for deep thought, or, a visual metaphor might be, a surgeon stitching up a piece of clothing, and pricking his finger. I don't know. The idea is that, an immediate visual is standing in for, some sort of broader idea. You guys know what metaphors are. Overreading symbolism. That's kind of where I started this conversation about symbolism. We can really read way too into symbolism. And the truth is that a director or a scenic designer will put in a whole lot of symbolism. They'll think real hard about, like the use of the shape of circular shapes in the frame. I'm serious. They'll really think that hard about this kind of stuff. But are we to study the film and sort of decode and discover all this? I don't necessarily think so in terms of our experience. I think when we walk away from something that has a lot of deep symbolism, what we really come away with is a feeling that it was very specific, that it was very intentional and very thought through, and our attention is well guided. The idea that putting symbolism in a film is really, I think, putting detail into it, really thinking hard about it, and not making arbitrary choices. That's what the filmmaker is trying to do. And it comes through at the end through experience of feeling like it was really a masterful experience in terms of, what the filmmaker intended for us. So I don't necessarily think there's direct translation. But when you go back and you study a scene and you do uncover symbolism, all it simply points out to you is that the filmmaker really put a lot of thought and detail and specificity to what they're doing. And that is something you want to discover and talk about. Okay. Irony. Irony is, really think of it in terms of contradiction. When, a funny contradiction. Dramatic irony, we know, means from storytelling that the audience knows more than a character in the film in terms of the conflict. We know more about the conflict than the character. So when the girl is walking down the hallway and, trying to find her cat, and we know that there's a man with a knife standing behind the door waiting to stab her in the face, that's dramatic irony. Okay, we know more than the female character, and it creates tension because we're, like, oh man, what's going to happen? Irony of a situation simply means that there's a contradiction between the situation somebody's in and, for instance, when a surgeon is being cut open and having their heart transplant, when the doctor becomes the patient. That's also irony of a character in the sense of, when, a homeless person has $1 million, or, there's some contradiction to what we identify as who they are, and, some aspect that puts that character on its head. Another contradiction would be watching a police officer steal a candy bar from a store. There's irony in that character. Our assumptions about who they are, our assumptions about a particular situation, are contradicted by some other aspect. These are good things to have. I mean, for every character, you want to create a contradiction. You want to create some irony. For every situation, and situation is kind of a broad term, but it means, it's, a character in a particular setting trying to accomplish something. Doesn't necessarily bring in opposition, but that might be part of the contradiction. Irony of the setting, irony of the setting. So, like, Disneyland, right? What would be ironic about, a setting Disneyland when, I guess somebody riding a roller coaster falls off and dies, I mean, it's just like, that's not something we expect to see at Disneyland. Irony of the tone, I mean, there's a lot of genres like the black comedy where, people are getting their heads cut off and we're laughing about it. I mean, there's something ironic about that tone. Or, when we have a certain expectation about, well, this film feels very melodramatic and sad, and then something happens and we unexpectedly laugh or unexpectedly react in a way that we didn't expect. That there's an irony to that, and cosmic irony. I'm still trying to figure that out, and maybe that's what cosmic irony is. It's just, when ultimately it's just when we think we know the way the universe works, and we have certain expectations about that, in a broad sense, how can we create a contradiction to, those, cosmic expectations? I don't mean stars and nebulas and shit. I just mean, how we expect the world and the universe to work. It's a pretty broad concept, but, some cosmic irony is, could be, throughout the film, it seems like a very straight story. We're just watching a character do something, and then all of a sudden, honestly, what comes to mind, and this is kind of funny, is I saw the film Gravity, and Gravity is sort of like this really, it tries to create a realism in terms of these astronauts in space. There's a lot that goes into it to make it seem real and believable, like you're watching some sort of IMAX, film of this stuff really happening in space. So, and the character is dealing with very real situations. But all of a sudden, a moment happens, and we've suddenly slipped into a whole different reality, and we go from very objective reality to very subjective reality. And I would call that cosmic irony, because we don't immediately identify that shift from objective to subjective. I don't want to give the story away so much, but it's also, a character makes a choice, a very, fateful choice, and then cosmic irony steps in and alters the course of her decision. Might have to see the movie and maybe understand, my point about that, but that's my best guess about what cosmic irony means. Okay, and let's see, I got one more slide here. So I got a list of questions, and your assignment this week is simply to go through these questions and watch your film and answer these questions as thoroughly as possible. and really these questions are related to everything that we've just talked about. So, I'm not going to step through all these questions. I'll go ahead and end the video here, and I'll let you go through these questions, and please spend some time answering these questions. Don't just say, how well is it unified in plot and storyline? Don't just write well. Okay, talk about it. What do you mean by, if it was unified or not? If it was, explain, how it was unified, how you saw it to be unified. A huge aspect of this class, and a huge aspect of you becoming educated in how cinema works, is learning to articulate what's going on and how a film works. Okay, so this exercise is really about articulation. It's less about how well can you write a paper in a critical analysis. It's how articulate can you become about how a film works. So step through each of these questions, answer them thoroughly, and hand it in next week. Okay, that's all for now.